On the coldest night of a Montana winter, a sheriff opened his cabin door and found something the mountain had nearly erased. A German Shepherd puppy frozen into the snow. Its breath so weak he had to lean down just to see if life was still there. In that moment, he could have closed the door and saved himself the pain, but instead, he chose to stay. What followed was not just a rescue, it was the return of hope, the healing of grief, and the beginning of a family that winter could not destroy. If you have ever believed that one small act of kindness can change everything, stay with us and tell us where you are watching from in the comments. Because this story might be meant for you tonight. Winter had a way of making small towns feel like myths that forgot their own names. In the high country of western Montana, the mountain air turned sharp enough to sting the lungs, and the snow fell in quiet sheets that softened every sound as if the world had agreed to speak in whispers. The town below the ridge, more a handful of streets than a dot worth bragging about, kept its lights low and its hours early. After dusk, only the occasional porch lamp glowed like a lighthouse for no ships. Up on the slope, beyond the last plowed turn, a narrow dirt road climbed toward a scattering of cabins tucked among black pines and wine-bent firs. That night the temperature had dropped hard, the kind of cold that didn't threaten so much as decide. The wind slid through the trees with a steady, patient cruelty, and the porch steps of a lone cabin gathered a skin of ice as if the mountain itself was sealing the door. Caleb Mercer lived in that cabin, and he lived there the way a man lives inside a locked room, not because it was comfortable, but because it was contained. He was 46, tall and broad-shouldered, built like someone who'd spent his life in uniforms that required straightbacks and controlled breaths. His hair was kept short, dark with a faint scatter of silver at the temples. His face carried the weathering of winter wind and old discipline. Strong jaw, a thin scar cutting from the edge of his eyebrow toward his cheekbone. The kind of mark that looked less like a story and more like a warning. Caleb's eyes were a pale, steady gray, the color of a frozen river, and they had the particular watchfulness of a man trained to notice what other people missed. As the town's sheriff, he was respected. As a neighbor, he was mostly a roomer, polite when required, distant by choice. His personality had once been open. People said he used to laugh easy, the kind of laugh that made you forget the cold for a second. But grief had sanded that warmth away, leaving something quieter, sharper. 4 years ago, on a stretch of icy highway, not unlike the one that curved below his ridge, a car accident had taken his wife and their little girl. Since then, Caleb had collected routines the way some men collect charms. Morning coffee at the same time, patrol paperwork stacked in precise rectangles, boots lined up by the door as if order could stop the world from breaking again. That night he slept lightly, the way he always did when the wind rose. The cabin creaked under the pressure of cold, logs contracting, nails tightening their grip. The wood stove had burned down to a low red breath. Caleb lay in the dark with one arm thrown across his chest as if holding himself together. Sleep came and went in thin, uneven strips. And then, somewhere beyond the wall, a sound arrived, faint, wrong, and small. It was not a knock, not exactly. More like a scrape, the softest drag across wood, as if something had tried to climb and failed, then tried again. The sound threaded itself into the room and tugged on Caleb's attention the way a hooked line tugs on a fish. He held still, listened. The wind made 1,000 noises, and any one of them could pretend to be something else. But this was different. Too deliberate. Too tired. Caleb swung his legs out of bed. The floorboards were cold enough to bite through socks. He pulled on flannel and a heavy coat without turning on the overhead light, moving by habit and memory. He slipped boots on with the quiet speed of someone who'd spent years trying not to wake sleeping houses. On the small table near the door sat his sheriff's hat, dusted with a fine line of snow he hadn't brushed away earlier. He left it there. He didn't need a badge to answer a sound like that. The moment he opened the door, the cold came in first. An animal presence, sharp and eager. Wind shoved against his chest, and snowflakes slid past the porch light in diagonal streaks. The porch steps below were coated in ice, slick as glass. Caleb's breath appeared in front of him in thick white puffs. He scanned the tree line automatically. The shadowy edges of the clearing, the fence posts half buried. Nothing. Then his gaze dropped to the top step. A puppy lay there, so small it seemed impossible it had made it that far. A German shepherd, black and tan, though the colors were muted by frost, no more than 6 weeks old. Its fur was stiff with ice, clumped into sharp little spikes along its ribs. Snow had gathered in the hollow of its belly and along its paws. The ears were still soft and folded in that newborn way, not yet strong enough to stand. Its muzzle was pale with frost, and a thin string of ice hung from its chin like a cruel ornament. The puppy's body was curled inward, trying to become smaller than the cold, and it looked as if it had fallen asleep and forgotten how to wake up. For a moment, Caleb did not move. The porch light painted the scene in a narrow circle, like a spotlight on a stage that had chosen him without asking. His mind reached for the old armor. Not your problem. Wildlife. Someone else's dog. The mountain takes what it takes. He had said versions of those sentences in his head before, whenever life offered him something that might make him care again. Caring, he'd learned, was a door that swung both ways. It let warmth in. It also let devastation return. But then the puppy made a sound. Barely a sound at all. A breath that caught. A tiny, uneven whimper that was less noise than confession. I'm still here. Caleb's body moved before his thoughts could form a proper argument. He stepped out into the snow, the boards creaking under his weight, and knelt. The cold soaked through his jeans instantly, biting into his knees. He reached toward the puppy, hesitated, then slid his hands beneath the stiff little torso. The fur was cold enough to shock him. The puppy's skin felt like winter itself. Its weight, or lack of it, made Caleb's throat tighten. It was too light, the way a living thing should never be. "Hey," Caleb murmured, voice rough from disuse. He did not remember the last time he'd spoken softly to anything. The word came out like a warning and a prayer at once. He lifted the puppy gently, and the ice that had held it to the step cracked with a faint snap. The puppy's head lolled against his palm. Caleb pressed the small body against his chest, tucking it into the shelter of his coat. He could feel the puppy's heartbeat, weak and frantic, fluttering like a trapped bird. That heartbeat did something to him. It cracked a seam he'd spent years stitching shut. He turned back toward the doorway, and as he stepped inside, the warm air from the cabin met the puppy's frozen fur. Caleb shut the door with his heel, sealing out the wind. The room looked suddenly different with that small bundle in his arms, as if the cabin had been waiting for a reason to be more than a shelter for one man's solitude. He crossed to the wood stove and knelt near it, laying the puppy down on a folded towel by the hearth. The firelight flickered across the pup's face, catching the crystals of ice like tiny shards of glass. Caleb stripped off his gloves and began to work, slow and careful. He used his fingers to loosen the frozen clumps, never pulling too hard, afraid of tearing delicate skin. The puppy trembled once, a faint shiver, then went still again. Caleb's hands started to shake. Not from cold, not entirely. He'd faced armed men. He'd walked into houses where people were already dead. He'd stood in the middle of highway wreckage with sirens screaming and done what needed doing. And yet this small, silent creature made him feel more helpless than any disaster scene ever had. Because this wasn't duty. There was no protocol for what to do when hope shows up half frozen on your steps. He grabbed another towel, warmed it near the stove, and wrapped the puppy like a fragile secret. The puppy's breathing was shallow, irregular. Caleb leaned close, watching the faint rise and fall of its chest as if his attention alone could keep it moving. He rubbed its tiny paws between his hands, coaxing blood back into places that had nearly surrendered. "Stay," he whispered, the words slipping out before he could stop it. A command, yes, but also a confession. "Stay, because I don't know what I'll do if you go." Outside, the wind continued to prowl. Snow tapped against the window like impatient fingers. But inside, Caleb Mercer sat on the floor in front of the stove, shoulders hunched forward, his whole body forming a shield around a life that had no business surviving that night. And in the wavering orange light, the mountain's silence changed shape. It was no longer only emptiness. It was waiting. Caleb stared down at the puppy's face, at the ice melting slowly along its whiskers. He did not know where it had come from. He did not know why it had chosen his porch. But he knew, with a certainty that landed heavy in his chest, that something had happened the moment he opened that door. Something he could not undo. He reached out and placed 2 fingers lightly against the puppy's side, feeling the faint, stubborn pulse beneath the fur. A fragile insistence, a tiny refusal. And for the first time in 4 years, Caleb Mercer did not feel the urge to run from what he cared about. He stayed on the floor by the fire, listening to the puppy breathe, as the storm did its best to erase the world outside. The storm did not leave when the door closed. It simply lost its voice. Outside, the mountain continued its long, patient argument with the night. But inside Caleb Mercer's cabin, another kind of weather had begun. The fire breathed low and steady, orange light climbing the rough log walls and settling into the corners where dust had learned the shape of loneliness. Caleb sat cross-legged on the floor, his back against the hearth. The German shepherd puppy wrapped in 2 towels on his lap like something both ancient and impossibly new. The puppy's fur was no longer rigid with ice, but the cold had not released its claim entirely. The tiny body still trembled in shallow, uncertain waves, as though unsure whether warmth could be trusted. Caleb watched the chest rise, fall, rise again. Each movement felt like a fragile vote in favor of staying. The puppy was young, no more than 6 weeks. Its coat, black along the spine and soft tan around the face and paws, was thin and uneven, still growing into itself. The ears lay folded against the skull, too soft yet for the proud angles that would someday define the breed. One paw twitched, an unconscious reflex, and Caleb flinched, afraid of the motion as if it might signal retreat instead of life. He stripped off his coat and wrapped it around the towels, adding another layer of himself between the fire and the cold that clung to the pup. His own hands were numb, red from the winter's bite, but he did not care. He rubbed the puppy's paws again, slow and patient, coaxing blood back into places that had almost surrendered. Every movement was careful, restrained, the way he used to treat evidence or injured men. No rush, no waste, no mistakes. The cabin clock on the wall ticked with exaggerated volume as though offended by the quiet. Caleb glanced at it, then back at the puppy. Time had shifted its meaning. There was only the next breath, the next rise of that tiny chest. "Easy," he murmured, his voice hoarse. He could not remember the last time he had used that tone. Low, steady, meant for someone who was afraid. It surprised him how naturally it came back. The puppy's eyes fluttered. Just for a moment. Dark, unfocused, like 2 small pools of night. Caleb's breath hitched. The eyes closed again, but the movement was enough to break something loose inside his chest that had been braced for years. He reached for the small first aid kit on the shelf, the one he had not opened since before he learned he would never again hear his daughter's laugh in this house. Inside, beneath antiseptic wipes and old bandages, he found a rubber dropper, a relic of past intentions, of lives he had once planned for. He filled a mug with water from the kettle, warmed it near the stove, and added powdered milk he kept for emergencies, stirring slowly until the mixture turned pale and smooth. He tested the temperature with his finger, the way he had once tested IV fluids in another life. Not hot, not cold. Just enough to pretend it was summer. He drew the milk into the dropper and touched it gently to the puppy's mouth. At first, nothing happened. Caleb waited. He did not force it. He had learned long ago that pressure killed more often than it saved. Then, the smallest change. The puppy's mouth parted, barely, and the tongue flicked. A single swallow followed. Caleb closed his eyes. He fed the puppy a drop at a time, whispering nonsense that meant nothing and everything. The puppy drank, weakly, clumsily, but the act itself felt like a vow. After a few minutes, its breathing steadied, just a fraction, enough to loosen the tight wire in Caleb's chest. He wrapped the puppy again, pressed his palms along its sides, breathing warmth into the space between his hands. He could feel the heart now, not frantic anymore, just small, stubborn, insistent. Stay. The word returned to him, this time without sound. As the night dragged on, memory crept in where it always did when he tried to focus too hard on the present. A hospital room washed in sterile light. The smell of antiseptic and metal. His wife's hand in his, her fingers cold despite the machines. Their daughter's empty crib at home, assembled but unused. Promises that had been spoken into air that did not listen. Caleb shook his head sharply, as if the motion might dislodge the past. He refused to let it sit beside him on the floor. Not tonight. Tonight belonged to the small creature breathing against his palms. The wind pushed against the cabin walls. Snow hissed along the windows. The mountain tested the world. Caleb stayed. At some point near dawn, the puppy whimpered. Not the helpless cry from before. Something different. A thin, questioning sound, like a thread of voice trying its first word. Caleb leaned closer. "I'm here." The puppy's nose wrinkled. One paw stretched. Its body remained weak. But it was no longer drifting. It was holding. He needed a name. Not because names saved lives, but because life felt less fragile when it was called something. The word came to him quietly. Echo. He did not say it loudly. He said it like one says a promise that cannot be taken back. The name fit. The sound of breath returning to a house that had forgotten what it meant to answer. Morning came without ceremony. The storm loosened its grip, leaving the world pale and aching and new. Caleb had not slept. His body ached, his eyes burned, but he did not move from the floor. He would not trade his place by the fire for anything. When the first light crept across the floorboards, he looked down at Echo, because the name was already real now, and saw something he had not dared to hope for. The puppy's chest rose in steady rhythm. Not strong, not safe, but steady. Caleb exhaled, long and slow. He did not know what came next. He only knew that the mountain had tried to take something from him again, and for once, he had refused. The second sunrise after the storm arrived like an apology the mountain was not used to making. Light spilled slowly across the ridge, pale and thin, brushing the snow until the world looked less like a battlefield and more like something waiting to be forgiven. Caleb Mercer stood at the small window of his cabin, a mug of coffee cooling between his palms, watching the smoke from his chimney rise straight into the clear morning sky. The wind had finally eased, leaving behind a silence so deep it felt almost ceremonial. Behind him, near the hearth, Echo slept. The puppy's breathing was still fragile, but it had settled into a rhythm that Caleb had memorized. Each rise and fall of that small chest had become the axis around which the cabin now turned. He had not slept more than minutes at a time, waking at the slightest sound, the way he used to on night patrols. He found he did not resent the exhaustion. It felt earned, necessary. Echo lay on a nest of towels and an old flannel shirt, the black and tan fur beginning to lose its icy stiffness. At 6 weeks old, the pup was little more than a bundle of bone and instinct, but there was something fierce in the way its tiny body clung to warmth, as if it had decided that living was no longer optional. Caleb knelt and checked the pup's temperature again with the back of his hand. Warmer. Not enough to be safe, but enough to mean the night had not stolen him. Good, Caleb murmured, and was surprised to hear the word come out gentle. He fed Echo again, slowly with the dropper. The puppy drank more this time, still weak but determined. Milk beaded along its chin, and Caleb wiped it away with the corner of a towel, careful, reverent, as though he were handling something sacred. The knock came mid-morning. It was not loud. It did not need to be. The mountain carried sound too well. Caleb's body reacted before his mind, shoulders tightening, attention narrowing. He set the mug down, stood, and moved to the door with quiet control. His hand hovered near the frame, habit more than necessity. When he opened it, the cold brushed past him again, but it no longer ruled the room. On the porch stood Eleanor Hayes. She was 72, small-framed, narrow-shouldered, her posture still upright with a stubbornness that age had not managed to bend. Her silver hair was braided neatly down her back, the strands catching the light like frost. She wore a heavy wool coat, the color of dried leaves, thick gloves, and boots that had known more winters than Caleb could count. Her face was lined, not with bitterness, but with the kind of patience only grief could teach. Eleanor lived alone on the neighboring ridge, nearly 2 miles away. They had spoken fewer than a dozen times in the 4 years Caleb had lived here. Brief exchanges of courtesy and necessity, nods at the post office, once when a fallen tree blocked the road. She had a voice that carried the faint rasp of someone who spent most of her days talking only to herself. "I saw smoke," she said, simple as that. "Figured either you were freezing or something was wrong." Her gray eyes moved past him into the cabin. They found the floor by the fire, the towels, the small shape breathing within them. Eleanor inhaled sharply. "Oh," she whispered. She stepped inside without waiting for permission, moving slowly, respectfully, as though entering a chapel. Echo stirred at the sound of new presence. The puppy's eyes fluttered, unfocused, but aware. A faint sound slipped from his throat. Not a cry, not yet. Something closer to a question. Caleb knelt beside him. "This is Echo." The name surprised him in its certainty. Eleanor lowered herself onto the floor with care that belied her age. She did not touch the puppy, not yet. Her hands hovered, trembling slightly, as if afraid the moment might shatter if she moved too fast. "He's so small," she said. "Just a baby. 6 weeks, maybe." She nodded once, swallowed, and looked up at Caleb. This time, really looked at him. At the scar along his cheek, the tightness around his eyes. The man who had been holding himself together with silence for far too long. "You haven't slept," she said. Caleb almost laughed. It would have startled them both. Eleanor reached into the bag she had brought and pulled out supplies. Clean cloths, antiseptic, a small tin of powdered goat's milk. "For emergencies," she said. "Didn't think I'd need it again, but I'm glad I kept it." They worked side by side in quiet coordination. Eleanor mixed fresh milk. Caleb fed Echo. The puppy drank more easily now, the tiny body responding to care the way all living things were meant to. Outside, the mountain watched. They sat by the fire as the morning aged into afternoon, the kind of hours that do not ask for purpose, only presence. Eleanor spoke first, eventually. "My son used to sit like that," she said, nodding toward Caleb, who had hunched forward without realizing it, his body curved protectively around the puppy. "When something needed fixing, didn't matter what it was." Caleb did not interrupt. "He was Army," she went on. "Came home different, tried to pretend he wasn't. We all did." She paused, drawing a breath that carried the weight of years. "Didn't save him." Caleb nodded once. Understanding, not sympathy. The day wore on. Echo slept, woke, drank, slept again, each cycle steadier than the last. By evening, the puppy managed to lift his head on his own. Eleanor's eyes filled with quiet tears. When she left, the cabin felt different. Not empty. Held. Caleb returned to his place by the fire, Echo warm in his hands, and for the first time in years, he was not alone with his grief. By the second week, the mountain no longer pretended to be gentle. The sky above the Montana ridgeline turned a hard, pale blue that only appeared when winter decided it had finished asking politely. The air carried that dry metallic bite that made every breath feel counted, as if the world itself were taking inventory of who still belonged in it. Snow remained thick along the tree line, but the paths between drifts had begun to harden, and the forest creaked and whispered with shifting ice. Inside the cabin, life had found a fragile rhythm. Echo was no longer the silent bundle Caleb had carried from the porch. At 6 weeks old, the German Shepherd pup was still small, his body narrow and light, ribs faint beneath the darkening coat. The black along his back had grown richer, the tan at his cheeks and paws warmer. And his eyes, deep brown now, no longer glassy, followed Caleb with a loyalty that seemed too large for such a small creature. His ears were beginning their uncertain rise, tipping halfway before surrendering again, as if the future could not quite decide which direction to stand. Caleb watched him closely as the pup wobbled across the cabin floor, legs unsteady but determined. Every step Echo took felt like an argument with the mountain. "I am here," I will stay. Easy, Caleb said, kneeling as Echo bumped against his boot and promptly lost his balance. Echo tumbled, righted himself, and barked once. Thin, startled, almost offended by gravity. Caleb laughed. The sound surprised him more than the bark had. Later that morning, Caleb layered up and stepped outside, Echo wrapped in Eleanor's old blanket by the hearth. The temperature had crept above zero but carried no mercy. Frost clung to the fence posts, and the trees stood rigid, their needles glittering like broken glass. Caleb followed the edge of the clearing, his boots crunching softly. He was not on patrol. This was his land, his mountain, and he knew its moods. Still, habit guided his eyes, trained to notice absence as much as presence. Tracks from deer crossed the snow near the tree line. A fox had passed in the night. But something else caught his attention. A narrow disturbance near the base of a cedar. Too sharp, too deliberate. He crouched. Steel. The trap lay half-buried beneath pine needles and snow, its jaws open, teeth waiting. Old, rust-stained, but oiled recently enough to move with lethal ease. The kind of device men placed when they did not care what they caught. Caleb's jaw tightened. He followed the faint trail, his pulse slow but heavy, and found another trap. And another. Each discovery felt like the mountain exhaling something rotten it had been hiding. That evening, Eleanor arrived as the light began to fail, her breath fogging the air, her braid dusted with frost. She had brought broth, folded cloths, and a small bottle of antiseptic, the careful habits of a woman who had learned long ago that help often arrived too late. "You look like you found something you don't like," she said, setting the basket down. Caleb told her about the traps. Her mouth pressed into a thin line. "There's been a man around the creek. Didn't recognize him. Didn't care to." The fire cracked between them. Echo stirred, now strong enough to lift his head and protest when the room grew quiet. The next day, Caleb took Echo outside for the first time. Not far. Just the edge of the porch, the pup bundled in a thick scarf and Caleb's coat. Echo's nose twitched wildly at the scent of snow and wood and sky, his small body vibrating with discovery. Caleb set him down carefully. Echo wobbled, froze, then took one step forward. Caleb's chest tightened. Another step. Echo's tail wagged once, uncertain, then again, more confident. And then, without warning, Echo trotted toward the tree line, drawn by some whisper only animals could hear. "Echo," Caleb called, already moving. The pup slipped past his boot, faster than expected, small paws carrying him over a drift's edge. The sound that followed sliced the air. Not a cry, not yet. A yelp, sharp with fear. Caleb sprinted. He reached Echo just as the steel jaws snapped shut, on empty snow. The trap's teeth missed Echo's paw by inches. Caleb dropped to his knees, scooping the trembling puppy into his arms, his breath tearing from his chest. He checked Echo's legs, his belly, his ribs, his heart pounding louder than the wind. Echo whined and buried his face against Caleb's throat. Caleb held him there, eyes closed, jaw clenched. The realization of how close he had come to losing this fragile life settling like ice in his veins. That night, the mountain did not feel empty. It felt watched. Winter returned that morning with a harder voice. The sky hung low over the Montana ridge, a flat sheet of white that pressed against the trees until even the mountain seemed unsure of its own shape. The snow that fell was finer now, sharper, carried on a wind that did not wander but cut. Caleb Mercer stood at the window of his cabin, watching it drift and settle, his reflection staring back at him from the glass, like a man he had once known but no longer fully trusted. Behind him, Echo slept. The young German shepherd was stronger now, no longer the trembling bundle of the first nights, but still far from the powerful creature he would one day become. His coat had thickened, the black along his spine glossy and the tan at his chest deepening in color. His ears had begun to rise in uneven stages, one standing briefly before giving up and folding again, a habit that made Caleb smile when he thought no one was watching. Echo's breathing was steady, his small chest lifting with quiet determination. Caleb turned away from the window and knelt beside him, pressing 2 fingers gently against the puppy's ribs. The heart beneath was solid. real, alive. That knowledge carried more weight than any badge he had ever worn. He rose and pulled on his coat. Today he would walk the perimeter again. Today he would make certain the mountain would not claim another life without resistance. Outside, the wind bit through his gloves as he followed the line of pines toward the creek. The snow held tracks from the night before, deer, fox, and the heavy boot marks of a man who did not belong. Caleb's jaw tightened as he followed them. He found 3 more traps. Each one was worse than the last. Old steel jaws, teeth chipped and cruel, anchored with rusted chain, hidden beneath branches and drift. Tools of suffering left by someone who never intended to look their victims in the eyes. Caleb disabled them with practiced efficiency, marking each location, memorizing the land the way he had learned to memorize battlefields long ago. The anger he carried was not wild. It was cold, focused, dangerous in its patience. When he returned to the cabin, Eleanor Hayes was already there. She stood near the table, her coat still on, her thin frame wrapped in gray wool, her silver braid loosened as if she had dressed in haste. Her eyes went first to Echo, then to Caleb. "I saw a truck near the main road," she said. "Didn't recognize it." "He was watching the ridge." Caleb nodded once. "I found more traps." Her mouth pressed tight. "I called the county again." Same answer as before. They shared a look of understanding that did not need words. The knock came late afternoon. A courier truck, the kind that climbed mountains for men who paid enough to demand it, idled outside. The driver handed Caleb a crisp white envelope. Inside was an offer: private security, high pay, fast deployment. A return to the world where Caleb's training still mattered, where his past was an asset instead of a shadow. The letter spoke of structure and purpose, of familiar ground he had once known how to stand on. Caleb read it twice. He folded it carefully and placed it on the table. That evening, Echo followed him from room to room, unsteady but persistent, his small body refusing to let distance grow between them. Eleanor sat by the fire, mending a tear in one of Caleb's old shirts, her hands steady, her face calm in the glow. Caleb stood between them, the letter in his pocket like a second heartbeat. He thought of the city, of clean streets and clear rules, of rooms where the past did not whisper from every wall. Then Echo stumbled and pressed his head against Caleb's leg. Caleb knelt and lifted him, feeling the warmth of a life that had nearly vanished. He did not need the letter anymore. The decision settled inside him, quiet and irreversible. Later, when the wind rose again and the cabin creaked under winter's weight, Caleb fed Echo, checked the locks, and stepped outside one last time to scan the tree line. The mountain remained dark and watchful, but he no longer felt like a man standing alone against it. He went back inside, sat on the floor beside the hearth, and spoke the words that closed the door on the life he had been running from, and the one he had almost chosen again. "I'm staying," he said to the empty room. Echo's tail thumped once. Eleanor looked up from her sewing, her eyes soft, understanding without asking. Caleb stared into the fire, feeling the shape of his future settle into place. Outside, winter howled. Inside, something finally held. Winter returned the following year the way an old visitor does, without ceremony, without apology, simply settling itself into every familiar place and reminding the mountains who they belonged to. Snow fell in long, patient drifts across the Montana ridge, softening the world until even the sharp edges of memory seemed gentler beneath its weight. The trees stood wrapped in white, their branches bowed but unbroken. The wind still sang through the valley, but it no longer carried the voice of threat. It sounded almost settled. On the front steps of the cabin, a German shepherd sat watch. Echo was no longer the fragile bundle of bone and frost Caleb Mercer had carried from that same porch a year before. He was full-grown now, broad chest, powerful legs, thick black and tan coat that gleamed even beneath falling snow. His ears stood tall and certain, framing intelligent amber eyes that missed nothing. Snowflakes landed on his back and melted into the warmth of his fur, but he did not move. This place was his post. He had chosen it. Behind him, inside the cabin, Life moved with quiet purpose. Caleb stood near the hearth, rolling his shoulders beneath a heavy wool shirt, the firelight painting lines of copper across the walls he had reinforced with his own hands. At 47 now, he looked different. The same scar marked his cheek. The same discipline shaped his posture. But the weight that had once settled permanently behind his eyes had loosened. He carried it now instead of being carried by it. A small wooden sign hung beside the door. The letters carved carefully into the grain. Mercer, Echo, Home. He had carved it himself on a night when the wind howled and the past threatened to follow. The act had steadied him. At the table sat Eleanor Hayes, her thin frame wrapped in a knitted shawl the color of winter wheat, her silver hair pulled back into a neat bun that exposed a face softened by time but no longer guarded. Age had narrowed her shoulders and slowed her steps, but it had not taken her strength. It had only taught it where to rest. She lifted her eyes as Caleb approached. "He looks proud out there," she said, nodding toward the window. "He earned it," Caleb replied. Their days had settled into a rhythm neither of them had expected, but both had come to trust. Mornings began with shared coffee, steam rising between them like a promise. Afternoons brought small projects, repairing fencing, stacking firewood, tending the greenhouse Eleanor had helped Caleb rebuild from salvaged windows and warped boards. Evenings closed with supper, quiet conversation, and Echo stretched between them like a living bridge. The house itself had changed. The floor no longer creaked in lonely complaint. The air no longer echoed. Shelves were filled. A second mug hung beside Caleb's on the wall. Eleanor's sewing basket lived permanently near the hearth. Echo's blanket lay by the door, no longer for survival but for belonging. When night fell, the three of them gathered by the fire, its warmth pressing gently against the walls while the mountain kept its vigil outside. That evening, as the snow thickened, Caleb opened the door and stepped onto the porch. Echo rose immediately, shook the flakes from his coat, and trotted inside, pausing only once at the top step to look back at the forest. There was no tension in his stance, no alarm, only calm recognition, the way a creature acknowledges a land that once tested him and found him worthy of remaining. Caleb knelt and ran a hand along Echo's strong neck, fingers sinking into living warmth. Eleanor watched them, the firelight reflected in her eyes. "You know," she said quietly, "I never thought I'd feel this settled again." Caleb understood. He felt it too. He had not erased the past. He had not been freed from it. But he had learned how to carry it without breaking. They sat together as the fire burned low, the cabin wrapped in peace that was not the absence of hardship, but the presence of connection. Outside, winter held the mountains in its quiet grip. Inside, something stronger had taken root. Caleb looked around the room, at Eleanor's soft smile, at Echo's steady presence, at the sign visible through the window, and felt a gratitude that bordered on reverence. He thought of all the moments he might have turned away, and understood at last. Staying had been the bravest act of his life. Sometimes God does not answer our prayers with thunder or miracles in the sky. Sometimes he sends something small, fragile, and quiet into our path. A life that needs help. A moment that asks us to choose love over fear. And in choosing to save that life, we slowly discover that God is also saving our own. In our daily lives, we pass these moments more often than we realize. A kind word to someone who feels alone. A hand offered when it would be easier to walk away. A decision to stay when everything in us wants to run. These are not accidents, they are invitations from God. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from. Subscribe to the channel so we can continue sharing stories of faith, compassion, and second chances. May God bless you, your home, and everyone you love. May He protect your steps and fill your days with quiet miracles. And if you believe in the power of love and redemption, please comment. Amen.